I wanted to go through a little bit of the case study in terms of my experience and some of the experiences we've had around sort of policy writing and writing sort of in the public good. And I want to do a little bit of a compare and contrast between the writing that Creative Commons does and the writing that Communia does. So I already mentioned a little bit about what Creative Commons is. And not only do we provide the licenses, we also advocate and do policy writing and policy analysis so that people can understand how the licenses work, and so that the licenses can get implemented in the areas that we'd like to see, you know, in terms of publicly funded educational resources, publicly funded science, those sorts of areas. So we not only are providing these tools, we actually advocate for their implementation in sort of areas that revolve around the public good. What Communia is it's an interesting organization. It's a very small organization based in Europe. It's probably only like 10 people. Creative Commons is a part of it, so we help in terms of doing writing for them and with them. And what Communia is focused on right now is the reform of the copyright laws going on in Europe. Europe has been going through sort of a reform process for their major copyright laws that affect all of the EU. And they've been doing it over the last 2 years. And what Communia has been doing is been advocating for progressive changes to copyright that benefit users, that benefit the public interest. And I tried to pull back some of the sharp fangs of copyright so that it's more fair for teachers, for educators, for researchers, for individual creators. And it's been doing that for the last several years now. So I take a look at first Creative Commons. What kind of writing do we do? I mentioned, of course, we work just beyond, you know, only license adoption. We work in terms of to improve the sort of normative situation around sharing in the commons online. We advocate for open access to publicly funded research and educational content. But of course, if you look at Creative Commons and you look at some of the platforms that I mentioned, it's a wide variety of different areas that we write about. You know, it's not only sort of promoting open education, but it might be talking about, well, how can libraries leverage Creative Commons licenses to share more of their content online? Or, you know, how might cities, which are collecting and sharing lots of data in terms of, you know, health data, transportation data, crime data, how can they utilize Creative Commons? So we have a variety of different topics that we talk about. We also work in a very collaborative global community. So Creative Commons has affiliates that we work with all around the world in over 85 countries. So you can imagine there's a lot of different situations that we get in terms of writing. You know, it's not just writing from a US perspective. You know, we write from a global perspective or digging into a specific country, sort of copyright laws or some of the local issues that are happening there. Just yesterday, we were, you know, on the phone with people from Colombia who are going through some challenges with some of their copyright laws there. And we can get a little bit more into some of those examples. And of course, what comes with that is different languages. You know, we don't only write in English. I usually only write in English, but we actually work with our affiliates to translate posts from English to other languages and from other languages into English so we can share it on our sites. So if we focus, if we kind of jump over to the Communia example in terms of what are we sort of focused on? Of course, I mentioned we're focused on Europe. We're focused on copyright law reform, at least for now. Communia is very, what we call scripture-based in terms of we do mostly writing, you know, but writing in different ways, whether it's be writing blog posts, writing policy papers, developing designs with text as their base usually. But when I say scripture versus like producing videos and things like that, that's what I mean. Communia is a very expert policy community. So we write for a very expert audience, basically like policymakers based in Brussels and elsewhere. So that really affects the sort of language that we use in our policy writing. And I'll explain that a little bit more a bit later. We're a very distributed group. So, you know, I'm based in the US, but everyone else is basically based in Europe, but they're, you know, spread out as well. We have people in Warsaw, people in Amsterdam, people in Brussels, people in Lisbon. So we're very distributed. So that affects sort of how we collaborate and write together. Communia obviously, you know, has fewer topics that they discuss than Creative Commons, because I mentioned they're focused on this very nitty-gritty sort of copyright law issues right now. And of course, we write in various languages, but for the most part, the EU languages focus around English because that's a shared language that the EU uses in most of its policy documents. So if we step back, jump back again to Creative Commons, take a look at what are the audiences of the Creative Commons policy writing. And I think it's a more general audience. We can't really assume a lot of previous knowledge when it comes to our writing on the blog and elsewhere, because the ecosystem and the audience can be quite broad, and people come into the Creative Commons project at various times. The project is 15 years old now, but of course new people are coming into it all the time, and we want to ensure that they can understand it in a way that's easy and not overly complex, and sort of helps them realize what the project is and how they can become involved. So we can't write from a very expert voice. We have to kind of keep it more general. Of course, Creative Commons has a pretty big reach with our website now, and also with our social media accounts. So that really requires us to speak to a very general audience as well. We like to write from individual voices of the authors. And what I mean by that is, when we do writing on the Creative Commons blog, it comes from a particular person. So all of our blog posts are authored by a particular person and has their name attached to it and their photo attached to it. And I think this is good. I think it's nice to be able to promote people's writing, and also sort of know that it's coming from a person, and not just from like an organization and you don't really know who's sort of speaking. If we go over to the Communia example to contrast that, I mentioned our audience is very specific and it's very sort of expert. So it's EU policymakers, it's sort of bureaucrats within the government in Brussels and elsewhere. And by that, we can assume that they know some of the terminology, they know some of the acronyms, they know sort of the legislative process. So, in our policy writing, we can kind of get around having to explain that every time, because we know who our audience is and we know that they already understand some of those processes. Similar with Creative Commons, Communia also speaks mostly from individual voices. So, particular topics that I write on for Communia, such as sort of research areas and things around scientific research and text and data mining, I write those under my own name. It's not coming from like the Communia name. We've also developed some sort of writing guidelines for Communia, since we're all very distributed and we all sort of write, and we developed guidelines so that our writing kind of comes across with a similar structure, a similar tone, similar sorts of length, and those sorts of things. So we kind of have a template that we use, if we want to tackle a particular policy issue. Okay, it should be like at least 5 paragraphs long, but it shouldn't be over 10 paragraphs long. It should have a similar sort of structure in terms of headings, titles, those sorts of things. And we can go into a little bit of that in some of the examples as well. So what sorts of writing does Creative Commons do? We do blog posts, which I kind of see as the front page of some of our policy work, because it kind of offers a glimpse of what we're working on and what we're talking about. And usually underneath that, you can go deeper, So we use the blog post as a front page of the work. Maybe there's a policy paper behind that. Maybe there are some other links included within the blog post that you can kind of click through for more information or to kind of delve deeper. But we really utilize our blog as a sort of front page for our policy work and our work on writing in the public good. We do policy analysis. We do sort of more formal submissions to like public commenting periods, whether it be for like the US Copyright Office or sort of other areas that actually like have like requests for comment, and we actually engage in those. Just last week, we did one for a Canadian consultation. We write joint letters of support with others in our sort of ecosystem. So we just recently wrote a letter of support for an open access bill going on in California. And we did that in collaboration with several other groups from different library associations to open access advocacy groups. So we do that as well in terms of our writing types. Obviously, I already mentioned social media. It's such a big part and a big change in how we've developed our writing over the years as social media and Twitter and Facebook have become way more important ways of reaching new audiences and different audiences. So we've really focused on that as well. And then we also do sort of digital issue campaigning. So around things like Open Access Week, where we actually do writing and then have a call to action for people. So get people to sign a petition or to submit their comments to a government consultation, those sorts of things. If we jump over to Communia, what types of writing are they doing? It's very sort of expertise, like I mentioned. It's policy analysis. It's commenting on recent news that's coming up and reacting to what's going on within the parliament with regard to the copyright reform. It's focused on only a few sort of key issues that we talk about. So it's not everything under the sun. It's like a few things that we have expertise on. We also develop different sorts of design-focused resources like handouts or things you might actually take to a meeting with a policymaker so that they, it's just like a one-pager handout, with bullets, and it's sort of easy to understand and read. We've also conducted some original research because we have some people on staff that know about and are able to do that. Of course, we utilize social media as well. And we also do writing about certain events that we host. So just 2 weeks ago, we hosted an educational event in Brussels. It's like a week, sort of a day-long event. So we do like a wrap-up blog post on that. A few other observations, and we can wrap this section up, about things that affect sort of both Creative Commons and Communia in terms of policy writing and writing for the public good. And maybe we can delve into a little bit more of these, if they come up in question and answers as well. Sort of, we kind of like think about like, how do you be more proactive in your writing? I think a lot of our writing around the policy sphere is reactive, and sometimes you can't get around that. Terrible things happen all the time around the world. And I think a lot of our writing is defensive. A lot of our writing is trying to push back against, bad things that are coming through in sort of the policy space and the copyright space, because there's a never-ending, stream of these things, whether it be, rights holders pushing for copyright term to be extended even further, or like more penalties for copyright infringement. And I think a lot of our work is trying to push back against some of these, not helpful things that are going on. I think a common theme that we see in both organizations is how to decide like what to write about and when to write about it. You want to write in a timely fashion, so you want to be writing, in reaction to something within like a day or two, but also, trying to determine whether it's useful for us to write something or whether we might get someone else to do it. It all depends on various things and our various strategies. How do you measure the impact of your writing? This is really hard to do in terms of policy writing. How do you measure whether the things that we've been writing about and the things we've been advocating it for in our writing, actually made a difference? It's really hard to sort of measure that in the long term. Collaboration, of course, we continually think about not only in how we do our writing, what other organizations we collaborate, how we decide when to join up with other groups in terms of developing an issue campaign or writing a joint letter to Congress, those sorts of things. We never want to be writing sort of as just our voice. It's always better to have a collaboration between different groups because it helps it be stronger. We have a 4 eyeballs approach, so nothing ever goes out based on one person's writing. Someone else always has to review it. And this is helpful, just to catch like typos, but also to provide sort of a gut check. Do we really want to be saying this line? Okay, maybe change this language a little bit to make it more palatable for our audience, those sorts of things. So we have a 4 eyeballs rule. Of course, something that differs between organizations, but that we continually think about is what communication tools do we use? For Communia, we're very distributed. We use Slack a lot as a communications tool. And we kind of do all of our conversations there, deciding about how we want to write, sharing drafts of versions of what we're writing about, those sorts of things. We eat our own dog food. By this, I mean we release everything we write under Creative Commons licenses or directly into the public domain so that anyone can use it and reuse it. We try to think about design as much as possible, even though I think we can always get better with this. It's always nice that something that you write looks nice or is organized or nice and actually has an image to go along with it or a design to go along with it to catch people's eyes. And then finally, we also need to think about process considerations in addition to what the substance of what that we're writing about. We try to bring this up as well. So for example, Creative Commons has been getting more involved with writing about things like copyright policy being made through closed door negotiations on sort of international trade. And it's really hard to write about policy stuff if we don't know what policymakers are talking about because it's being talked about in secret. So not only do we need to bring up the substance, the copyright aspects of these trade negotiations, we also need to raise the issue that like, hey, why aren't we getting access to these things? Why can't civil society, why can't the public see what's being discussed behind closed doors because it's going to affect their lives? So we need to bring up those process considerations as well. So let me just stop there. I have a few examples that I just wanted to show in my tabs here. Can you guys still see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just go through some examples, then we can delve into the final section, which talks a little bit about sort of developing open access policy and things that we've learned. So just a few examples of some of the writing that we do and sort of how we deal with it, I guess. So I mentioned, Creative Commons submits comments to public policy commenting periods. And we actually host like a site on our wiki that tracks all of these. And this is helpful because for me at least, because it's like go back and look at sort of what we've submitted public comments to. So, there's one on sort of trade negotiations. There's one on submission to the Copyright Board of Canada. And it's really helpful just to have links to these on a single page that we can like reference, both internally and to share out with other people. So that's something that we sort of keep track of in terms of our policy writing. I wanted to do a little bit of a compare and contrast between some of the stuff that we write with Communia and some of the stuff we write with Creative Commons. And you can kind of see the differences right here and even in the titles. So, we wrote about the same thing that happened last week. So I mentioned that EU's kind of going through some of these copyright changes and floating ideas, and we write about it in one way on the Creative Commons blog. So the title of this blog post is Head of the Copyright Committee Wants to Deny EU Creators the Right to Share. And it's sort of a general blog post that takes people through what's going on in Europe, what is happening with regard to this specific piece of policy legislation that's being pushed through, and how it affects people, talking to a general audience. Now, at the same time, I wrote this article on Communia blog. It's the same topic, but like I said, Communia writes for a very specific and expert-oriented policy audience. So this is it's more detailed and it assumes a lot more. So you can even see this in the title, MEP Voss doubles down on worst elements of Article 11. So first of all, like our audience knows what this means. MEP means member of the European Parliament. Voss, they know that's the lead of the Copyright Committee. Article 11, they know that this is the particular piece of legislation that we're talking about. So it's interesting because we can delve a little bit faster and deeper into the policy issues because we assume that on on the Communia blog, the audience knows what we're talking about. So, similar topics, different writing styles around policy. Let's see. Oh, this is an example of some of the writing we do for our events. So I mentioned we had this event last week in Europe. Do a wrap up of the event. We also had someone do a video for us, and we actually had a professional photographer there taking photos for us. This is actually really important too, to sort of demonstrate there's like real people and real faces like working on these policy issues, and also real faces behind the writing. So, and actually this photographer, he's great. He shares all of his photos under Creative Commons licenses. So, it's really useful for us to be able to share and get them out into the world. We also do writing. This is the Creative Commons blog on different sort of like advocacy weeks. So this is like Copyright Week, which delves into different topics, and we wrote on several of them during the week. This one's on the public domain. Just giving you examples of different things we write about. We also do collaborations with different organizations. So this is an organization based in Colombia that works with us on Creative Commons issues. This is a campaign we worked with them on to provide a legal defense fund for this student that was getting sued because he shared a scientific research online, article online. So we worked with them on a crowdfunding campaign to actually fund some of his legal costs because we thought it was unfair. And we thought that he should have open access to this research that's being funded by the public. This is actually a website, like this is a separate project that Communia did around making education more fair for teachers and for users. So not only do we utilize our blog and our primary websites, we actually develop other websites as well, specifically around sort of issue campaigns like this. This is another example of like projects or like advocacy weeks that we work on. Open Access Week, we did several writings on there. This is an interesting one. I mentioned we're doing more writing with our global community on issues that affect several different countries. And one is on these like trade negotiations. So we wrote a policy paper together based on this trade negotiation that's going on in South America and in Europe. So we wrote a policy paper together. We wrote a blog post explaining the policy paper. And then we also had our local communities translate both the policy paper and the blog post into the various languages that are affected by the proposed agreement. So we had people in Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, as well as Europe. But the South American countries, they speak Spanish and Portuguese. So we had the policy paper translated into Spanish by them, and also Portuguese. So this is actually very useful, and I think a lot of groups aren't able to do this. Creative Commons is a very broad reach, and we are able to do this. And I think it's very helpful to not only present your policy writing in English, which is obviously the language that a lot of policy is done in, but also in the local languages so that people can read it and understand it in the common language. And this is actually very, very powerful, I think. We also work on sort of advocating not just for issues that are central to like Creative Commons, but also issues that are important for the open web and sort of the other organizations that revolve in our sphere. So we write posts on protecting network neutrality, which is a big thing that's been talked about in the United States over the last several years, but more importantly in the last few months, because the FCC was trying to roll back net neutrality rules. So we add our voice there and point people to where they can get more information on this issue and do a little bit of a tie with how it affects our issues as well. I'm going to skip over some of these. Yeah. So similar with how I mentioned, like we have a big running list of all of our sort of policy papers and submissions. Communia does the same thing. We have various policy papers, providing them in PDF as well as sort of like just in HTML on our website is very important so we can access them easily, share them out easily with other people. Here's an example of some of the other types of things that we do. Here's an example of a one-pager, that we write on the copyright form going on in Europe that we can bring to meetings. It sort of looks nice, it has like some design to it. It has bullets about like, what's the problem? What are we trying to work on around it? It's easy to share, it's easy to print out, and it kind of like looks okay. We also do this research, like I mentioned. So, we have research reports that we create. What else? Okay, I think that's all on that sort of section.